Welcome to this talk on Augjort, a partially synchronous finality layer for blockchains. My name is Daniel and this is joint work with Thomas, Bernardo, Christian and Jesper. Now, before we talk about blockchain, let's have a quick look at the underlying network assumptions here. We assume that parties are connected in a peer-to-peer network, like the internet. That means parties can send messages all along. However, those messages can be delayed. Luckily, the delay is bounded, but unknown to honest parties. In particular, that means that we cannot use that delay bound in our protocols. Now, as this is a work about a finality layer on top of a blockchain, we also have to assume a blockchain. Now, we don't want to assume a specific blockchain. Instead, we look at a family which we call the Nakamoto-style blockchains. Such a blockchain works as follows. You have a lottery mechanism that picks a winner, say Alice here, and then that winner can create a block. And winner add their block to their best chain. Now, think about this like Bitcoin. Bitcoin is of this style. A best chain rule essentially could mean that you take the longest chain according to the number of blocks. Now, for our finality layer, we assume that the blockchain has the following three properties. First of all, we'd like to have that parties share a long common prefix. So as you can see here on the left, Alice and Bob, they have this common prefix there of the three blue blocks. Now, common prefix without chain growth would be silly. So we also want that the chain grows over time, because otherwise, common prefix is trivially achieved. And finally, for usability, we'd like to have chain quality. That is, the number of dishonest blocks in the chain is bounded. That, for instance, ensures that the adversary cannot censor your blockchain. All right. Why should we bother about finality? Or, in other words, when can I trust a transaction which has been put on chain? So let's look at a blockchain in this Nakamoto style. If you're lucky, you have low corruption, a really fast network, your chain looks like this. So on the top you have Alice and with her best chain, and on the bottom there that's Bob, and they almost agree. So they have a really, really long common prefix. Only for the last few blocks there it's not yet decided what the common prefix actually should be. However, of course, there's a problem, right? So if you have high corruption, or a slow network, right? So your lottery is kind of too fast. You produce a lot of blocks, but they're not really in a common chain. Instead, what you have is this sprouting. So your whole block tree explodes. There are many different forks, and thus the common prefix is really small. And that also means that, for instance, could well be that the chain Alice has there right now will be rolled back afterwards. So that's quite bad. So how do you now confirm a transaction for such a Nakamoto-style blockchain? The answer is pruned chains. So what you do is you chop off the X most recent blocks, and you consider the remaining path final. So here on the right you can see that for Alice and Bob. And of course, that assumes that if we chop off X blocks at any point in time, right, under any condition, that whatever remains should be on the common prefix, because that's the only part of the chain where honest parties have agreement on. And that brings us to our problem. This pruning of chains is inherently synchronous. So what you do is you make a worst case assumption about your corruption, about your delay, and that determines your X. And that X is then kind of fixed in your protocol. So that means, yes, while in the worst case your blockchain still works, you have still agreement on those things which you consider final. It also means that when you have good weather, when your chain should be running really fast, you still have to chop off X blocks, making your chain rather slow. So you have to wait long to get a transaction confirmed. So can we do better? Well, the basic idea of finality is to go over this block tree and start to agree on parts which we consider final. So, boom, here we have a final block, and whatever is above that final block is considered done, can't be changed. We continue like that, and as you can see, whatever is on side chains which are not directly above a finalized block just goes away, can't be rolled back, and we continue like that. And so if you now compare finality versus this pruned chain idea, our hope or the idea here is that with finality we can actually get as fast as possible in terms of confirmation in the current network condition. So in the worst case it might be still as slow as pruned chains because there is not that much of an agreement. However, if we are really in the good weather condition, the hope is that finality will be really fast compared to just pruning the chain according to worst case assumption. So now in our paper we also introduce kind of the desired properties we'd like to have from such a finality gadget on top of our chain. Those are obviously we need to agree on what is final. It should be chain forming, that is finalized blocks should form a chain. Then, and that is an important property, we want that it is up to date. That is the difference between the last finalized block and kind of the leaves of the chain is small. So we are always finalizing close to the new blocks. And finally, similar to kind of chain quality, we'd like to have a property which we call case support. The idea is if a block gets finalized, then at least k honest parties had that block on their best chain. And that property guarantees that whatever we decide upon in finalization, it is on a good chain. It can't be that the adversary comes up with some weird side chain and then that one gets finalized. So that brings us to how to finalize, or the Augeot protocol. So here are the key facts. Our protocol works on top of any, well, reasonable Nakamoto-style blockchain, where reasonable is roughly defined as has common prefix, and we have bounds on dishonest chain growth and chain quality. For more details, you can look at the paper. Moreover, this protocol is black box, so all it needs to know about the chain below are these properties, and the chain below doesn't really need to know anything about the protocol, except a small update to the best chain rule, which we'll look at in a bit. Moreover, Augeot can be run by a committee. So, in principle, it's up to you and your use case how to select that committee. If your underlying blockchain is, for instance, a proof of stake protocol, what you could do is you could select the committee according to stake distribution. But you're free. You could also have a permission committee running this protocol on top of an arbitrary blockchain. More details on committee selection are also given in our paper. So what about this updated chain rule? Well, actually it's quite a natural thing. So as we say, we start with some Nakamoto style blockchain which has the best chain rule. I mean, roughly translated, that's select the longest chain, right? And all we say is, well, we extend this in a lexicographic way, in the sense that first, to select the best chain, you count the number of finalized blocks. And then if you still have a tie, then you just use the existing longest chain rule there. And that gives you the updated chain rule. So it's kind of intuition that, of course, we want to prioritize chains which have more finalized blocks. Now then, Augeot produces what we call a finalization proof. And that is essentially a signature of the whole committee on that block. They sign that, yes, that block is indeed final. And it is distributed in the network at the end of finalization. Now, to ensure that newcomers, so someone who comes fresh to the system, will also have these proofs later on, we let parties include those proofs into blocks. And that defines what we call a finalization pointer. And so, if you like, what you can say is kind of, the time it takes to finalize a block, that's the time it takes from when the block was first introduced into the chain up to the point where there exists a block, which contains its finalization proof. So how do we now actually finalize with Augeord? Well, here you can see an overview of it. So in dark blue there, that's the finalization routine, which is done every time we want to finalize a new block. And it consists of two steps. First, we determine at what depth do we want to finalize in the block tree. And then once we have decided on that, we go and do some sort of voting in the finality routine. So what about this ideal depth D? Well, if you look here at our example, right, you can see our three honest parties and their common prefix. So ideally we would set D right at the end of the common prefix. The intuition here is that would ensure that we are up to date. And it's also nice because here we have already agreement. So if we would to vote on a candidate, there is only one candidate, so finalization should be pretty fast. If we would set D too small, well, in that case, finalization would still be fast, but of course, we would kind of miss out. We could finalize more in the same step. On the other hand, if we would set D too large, so maybe we set the depth even to a value where there are no blocks at that depth, then we would have to wait until we can actually start to finalize. And so in Augeord, what we have is some sort of heuristic which tries to set this depth correctly. The idea here is that we look at the previous finalizations and kind of estimate whether we set D there too small or too large and adjust accordingly. So now once we have set the depth, we now need to come up with the finalized block at that depth. And for this, we first have to talk about candidates. So what are valid candidates? Well, obviously, these are blocks which are at depth D. Moreover, we want that they are below the last finalized block. That ensures that we are chain forming. So in our case here, that's these three candidates there. And there's a third condition we require. We want that these blocks, the valid candidates, are in a chain of lengths D plus delta. So here in a picture, for instance, delta is one block. So why do we care about this third property? Well, this is about the following procedure. So the finality procedure works as follows, right? As an honest party, you wait until your block chain, your best chain, has a depth of D plus delta. At that time, you select your candidate for finalization. That's the block at depth D. So for instance here, if you look at Alice, right, she has the chain there on top. That's her best chain. So she will select the top block at depth D there. And then all parties use a BFT protocol to try to agree on this candidate. And if they agree, then we declare this block as final. However, it's a special type of BFT. It can also fail. So in that case, we have at least agreement on failure, and so we can now repeat finality protocol. But this time we increase delta. So let's have a look at this example. So we start with delta 1 and we try to agree, but as you can see, all our parties disagree. They all have their own candidate, and so no surprise, the vote fails. But no worries, so the party wait, the chain grows, and now all of them have a best chain with D plus 2 delta blocks. And so in this case, you can see that, for instance, Alice and Bob already pre-agree, but unfortunately, the vote still fails, and so we continue. And we go for 4 deltas. And so now, as you can see, eventually, D will be in the common prefix of all honest parties, as you can see here. And, well, at that point, latest, the honest parties will agree on a block and finalize it. So, that's this finalization idea. which we just looked at in the example. So you start with a chain where you already have fixed the depth, and you want to come up with the finalize block at the depth. So first of all, you have this determine candidates selection, and then you try to vote on the candidate, and that vote can fail. If it fails, you will select a new set of candidates, and this selection is done in a way to ensure that eventually there will be only one valid candidate, such that the vote then for sure succeeds. So how do we vote? Well, I can't go into details here in this talk, but what we use is called a weak multi-valued Byzantine agreement. And it has this property that if you have less than a third of corruption in your committee, it achieves the following property. So first of all, we have consistency. That means all honest parties agree on the outcome of this vote. And the outcome could either be, in our case, a block or failure, kind of, we have no agreement. And then we have weak validity. This is really important for us because it means that if there is exactly one valid input, note these inputs are our candidate blocks, right? Then that is indeed the output of the protocol. So that means if all honest parties agree kind of on the candidate, that will be the outcome of the vote. And so that ensures that our finality loop eventually terminates. Moreover, this protocol has a nice property, and that is the n-third support. So if the output is a block, then this block was input by at least n-third honest parties. In our paper we also have another variant. So this variant here gives you n-third support, but requires let's say strong properties of the underlying blockchain. If you don't want to assume these strong properties, you can also do it, but then you only get one support. More details on this choice you find in the paper. Moreover, of course, the protocol should terminate eventually. In practice, it's actually almost expected constant round. So that brings us here to this overview of Augjord. So on the outside, you see that's the big finalization round loop. And each finalization consists of the following steps. You determine the depth using a depth heuristic, where you hopefully select the perfect depth. Then, once that is selected, you go into the finality loop, where you determine the candidates, and then you vote using the weak multi-valued Byzantine agreement protocol. If the vote fails, you can repeat, select a new set of candidates, until eventually the vote succeeds. And then the whole committee signs that block, and the finality loop on the outside kicks in again. So what about our properties, right? At the beginning of this talk, I said that we want to have these 4 finality properties. Well, so how is Augjord in that regards? Well, we wanted to have our protocol to be up to date, so close to the leaves, right? That's done with our depth selection. This ensures that we are always up to date with finalizing blocks. Then the candidate selection here ensures that we are chain forming, because only candidates below the last finalized block are actually valid candidates. And then the agreement protocol gives us agreement and the support property here. So for the final minute of this presentation, let's have a quick look at experiments. So not only did we prove security of our protocols, we also run some experiments here. What we did is we selected an Ouroboros-Prous style blockchain and ran Augjord on top of that. So what you can see here, right, is we ran the Ouroboros-Prous with kind of 2 difficulty selections. On the top, we ran it with a target block time of 1 second, and below with a target block time of 15 seconds. And then we did that experiments for 10, 100 or 1,000 finalizers. And what you can see from these numbers is clear that if you have more finalizers, of course, the time actually grows. That is no surprise, as the communication complexity is quadratic in the number of participants. If you want to know more about these experimental results, you can look at the paper here on ePrint, or if you have questions, feel free to contact us here, either at Concordium or Cobra. Thanks.